Welcome to this webinar hosted by the 21st Century China Center at the School of Global Policy and Strategy, UC San Diego. CPS offers several master's degree programs to students all over the world, including one that focuses exclusively on the study of China, Master of Chinese Economic Political Affairs degree, MCPA in short. I am Wei Shi. I'm Assistant Professor of Political Science at GPS. My own research focuses on international political economy, China, and China's outward direct investment. So the topic BRI is very dear to my heart. And today we're very delighted to have Professor Denis Simon with us, discussing an incredibly fascinating topic on the growing role of science, technology, and higher education in China's Belt and Road Initiative. Denis is Senior Advisor to the President for China Affairs at Duke University and Professor of China Business and Technology at Duke's Fuqua School of Business. He also serves as Executive Director for the Center for Innovation Policy at Law School at Duke. Prior to Duke, Professor Simon spent several years in China, serving as Executive Vice Chancellor at Duke Kunshan in China from 2015 to 2020. He's fluent in Chinese and has decades of experience studying business, competition, innovation, and technology strategy in China. And he has a recent book on innovation in China as well. So after a presentation by Denis today, I will start a conversation and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Please use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. I'll be reading the questions as they come in for our speaker during the Q&A time at the end of the presentation. So welcome, and now the virtual floor is all yours, Denis.
Okay, thank you. Well, let me get up this PowerPoint and we can get started. Let's see here. Okay, do you have the screen share? Are we up there?
Yep, we're all good.
We're good? Okay, very good. Okay, well, thank you to the school and to the staff for their hard work in making this happen. And I'm going to talk about a topic that actually began to attract my attention in 2019. I sit on the board of trustees at the Asian Institute of Technology in Bangkok. And we were attending some board meetings, and the discussion of BRI started to become important because Thailand is a member of the Belt and Road, and we began to see a lot of attention going to the science and technology and education aspects. And this came out of some decisions that were made in 2019 that I'm going to talk about. So I think this is a kind of a different vantage point into BRI. Most of the discussion has been around big infrastructure projects and also around debt diplomacy. But I think there's a new dimension here that I think is very important that I'll talk about today. So let me see if I can get this going. Okay, so this past year, the Council on Foreign Relations did a study, and they issued a report on China's Belt and Road and its implications for the United States. And one of their conclusions was that the building of roads, ports, and railways, etc., is giving way to a new BRI centered on technology, and particularly telecom, connectivity, healthcare, and including fintech or financial services. And of course, there's a legacy of the debt diplomacy and also some of the environmental impacts that came about from the initial infrastructure projects. But now this emphasis on technology has really become, I think, a new centerpiece about BRI. Similarly, the Eurasia Group, which does a lot of policy-related research for both government and business, issued a report in April 2020 in which they began to look at the digital Silk Road, which, as we all know, is a critical part of this. And again, they sort of started coming to the same conclusion that China is starting to use technologies that are going to form the new foundation for a new digital economy along the BRI. And this is not only Xi Jinping's signature initiative, but it's also going to become a way for Chinese companies to leverage their advantages in technology along these 60 or 70 countries that form the BRI network. So we've got a kind of a new structure that's starting to be in place, and I think this is telling us something very important about Chinese thinking as we go forward. And another way to kind of capture this is, as I mentioned in 2019, while I was out in China, I started to notice, and that is that Wang Zhigang, who's the Minister for Science and Technology, also made a talk about the BRI, and he says China stands ready to join hands for all countries in building the Belt and Road into a road of innovation. So it gives you a sense that there is a kind of sea change going on. And I think, you know, as I will indicate, it's because China has recognized some of the problems in the initial phases of the BRI. The Xi Jinping, there is a journal called the Belt and Road Initiative Quarterly, and Xi Jinping produced an article that said science has no borders, but scientists have a motherland. Nonetheless, he came out with this statement, which is important. We must implement a more open, inclusive, mutually beneficial, and shared international science and technology cooperation strategy. And again, if you follow the Belt and Road, you know that there's been a lot of criticism about it being a kind of one-way street. You know, China leveraging its dominant position and perhaps even taking advantage of some of these countries. And I think in 2019, we saw this sea change come about and a rethink that started to go on. So in order to think about all this, I wanted to give us a little bit of a framework. And there are two dimensions to what's going on. One is the whole area of science diplomacy, and the other is the area of education diplomacy. And if you look at this, we can see that there are two in particular important dimensions: the use of science for diplomacy and the diplomacy for science, and the equivalent on the education side. Education for diplomacy and diplomacy for education. And I think China is sort of walking on two legs. It's trying to use cooperation in science to improve its relations with the BRI countries, but it's also trying to facilitate a certain level of science and technology cooperation, so perhaps it can get the BRI countries to adopt Chinese technical standards, to work with Chinese companies using their technology. In other words, there's a whole area of benefit that will accrue to China, not only goodwill in terms of political relations, but also good commercial outcomes that will help China improve its image and visibility as it goes through this. And the similar thing is happening in the field of education as well. And I'll talk about that in a minute or so. So if you look at the BRI initiative, again, we all know that there are a number of dimensions to it, but one of the things is the addition of this science diplomacy, as we can see in the upper left of this chart, and then to the right, as part of the cultural exchange, promoting more people-to-people cooperation, including in the field of higher education. And I think this is now part of a multilateral diplomacy that China is conducting and helping it to forge what it hopes are improved relations with these countries. So some of the bad PR that has existed all the way up through 2019 and beyond can dissipate, and China can have a more positive image as it tries to expand its role in the world. And I think it's starting to see science and technology as a very effective instrument for its foreign policy. And as I indicated, it's part of its diplomacy as well. You've all seen this, a map like this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but we can see obviously there's the land route of the Silk Road, and then there's a maritime route. When I was the EVC at Duke Quinshan, I was invited several times to Xiamen University, which is the home of the maritime Silk Road research Institute and attended a number of conferences. And China takes this part of its BRI initiative very, very seriously and wants to expand and grow it very rapidly, and got to see that from the inside out. There are just so many advantages to being on the ground in China. You can't be everywhere all the time, but you really catch a lot of news by being where the action is. And the last 2 years, as we all know, have been very difficult without being able to travel to China. So here I want to kind of talk about a quote from Claude Abogli, who is an expert on globalization, and he wrote that the BRI is basically helping to restructure globalization away from the linear model that has been widely accepted into a new kind of configuration with new trade and value chains and a new international financial order, and I would argue also a new science and technology order. And one has to look, down the road, but one could begin to see that as China cements its relationship with these Belt and Road countries and introduces its technical standards, its equipment, and its protocols, even for everything from encryption, that these are going to be very, very important parts that could, in fact, produce a bifurcation in the global system. And we see here that the US once dominated the system of setting technical standards, but China has already signed 90 different agreements with 52 different countries by the end of 2019 to help determine what technical standards these countries will use as they set up their telecom, information technology, cyber technology, et cetera, et cetera. So this is already something in process. Now, we know the BRI effort is multifaceted, and it has a lot to do not only with what's going on externally, but as a number of people have pointed out, it also has to do with things that are going on internally in China. And then particularly to close the gap between the eastern seaboard and the so-called 14 coastal cities and lagging parts of the Chinese economy in the western part of the country. And this has, of course, been a very, very important part. But if we look at more broadly, this idea of enhancing Chinese image, prestige, and visibility across these 65 different countries cannot be ignored as one of the central goals that China has had in mind. So there are economic drivers, financial drivers, there are political drivers, as I said, and then now we add to this science and technology element to the equation, and it really makes the whole BRI initiative even more interesting. So we have to kind of think of China as walking on two legs with the BRI. It's a strategy for international cooperation, but it's also part of China's development strategy. And we can look at it as, the Yangtze River Delta, the Pearl River Delta, what they call this new Bay Area, the area around Beijing, Tianjin, and Hebei, the whole new coordinated plan for that, and the Belt and Road Initiative, which is dealing primarily, but not solely, with the western parts of the country, and looking at the Silk Road as a way to help enhance Western China's long-term development. So this thing has built up a lot of momentum. There is a website called Yilu by the Chinese government, and it has lots of data and information. And by early 2021, China had signed over 205 different cooperative agreements with 140 countries. So I mentioned, 65, 70 countries, but in effect, there really is no limit on what countries are in or out of the BRI. If you sign an agreement and it says you're in, I guess you're in. And you can see, the African countries have formed the largest number in terms of these cooperative agreements, followed by Asia and then by Europe, and particularly what we used to call Eastern Europe during the era of the Soviet Union, these countries. And then, of course, there are elements in Oceania, Australia, New Zealand, South America, and North America. Now, the way we can see the BRI is progressing is that this is from some Chinese government data, is to look at the trade relationship between China and the BRI countries. And we can see from the graph on the left that The trade relationship is starting to grow, with the share rising from about 26 to 29%. And we can look at the growth in the import and export volume between these countries also as growing fairly steadily over the last 5-6 years. And indications are that it's going to continue to grow. And I think this emphasis on S&T is going to aid that and facilitate that. So I mentioned a number of times that 2019 is sort of a watershed period. This was the time when the second Belt and Road Forum was held, and Xi Jinping got hold of lots of concerns and lots of criticisms about the BRI, making it clear that the leadership role that China wanted to have was actually in jeopardy. And according to Xi Jinping's admonition, China had to fix the problems. And in particular, 3 or 4 stood out: corruption problems, lack of transparency, overly dominant role of Chinese companies, and in some cases, very serious environmental damage that had been caused. And this came through a number of studies, one of which the International Union for the Conservation of Nature looked at some impacts in Pakistan and Sri Lanka and expressed some really big concerns. And so basically she set out to say, look, we've got to change the game here. We've got to improve our behavior, improve our conduct. And so before 2019, as I mentioned, the big focus was on traditional infrastructure, roads, bridges, high-speed rail, etc. But after 2019, we start to see a greater focus on sustainable projects, green projects. And so the BRI is becoming increasingly oriented towards technology, becoming more environmentally friendly, including more inclusive projects, and making sure that the participation of the local economy is much greater than it had been. And this is part of the effort to create a new face for China as it goes out and pursues this Belt and Road. Now, in the 14th five-year plan, which was just recently announced, of course, last year, it's a if you look at it, it's a very big document, 19 sections, 65 chapters. Section 12 is the one really where we deal with the BRI situation, and it becomes very clear that China is intending to deal with the operational issues that have been mentioned. They're also looking to expand the agenda. We hear terms like an airborne Silk Road from now being talked about, and most important, there is the formal inclusion of the green Belt and Road to place more emphasis on climate change, marine conservation, and wildlife protection. These were things that were largely ignored up till now, but they're becoming much more important. And they're also added into this new evaluation criteria to make sure the projects are more high quality, that they're sustainable, they have reasonable pricing, and also there are more diversified financing options out there so that this problem of excessive debt that's been created doesn't become a source of complaint onward into the future. So let me talk more specifically now about the S&T focus as part of this. So as I said, science and technology innovation playing a much more bigger role. There was a very interesting article I would refer you to in Nature in 2019 that made the statement, China's science initiatives under the BRI are redrawing the map of world science. And that as China becomes more ensconced in working with these countries in the region, it's changing the dynamics of how China's international S&T relations are being conducted. And this also has a lot to do with, the working out of the details of these activities. So the Ministry of Science and Technology, which is the key agency, also working with the Chinese Academy of Sciences, has put in place a number of plans and programs in order to carry out. MOST also is playing a key role, even in the digital Belt and Road, even though companies like Huawei or ZTE may be the operating agents on the ground, the policy direction is being driven by MOST. And so this is a profound shift for China. So we always used to think that since the open door, China was much more focused on the US, Western Europe, etc. But there seems to be some kind of balancing so that China's relations with low and middle income countries are now growing fairly quickly. And that, China, which was a country that just left the ranks of the so-called developing world, these countries say, well, if the Chinese did this, maybe we need to follow the Chinese model. The gap is less, the experience may be more useful. And so China has gotten some traction now in these countries as they look to China for help, assistance, and guidance. And so, as I said, there are all these special plans that have been put in place. I think the interesting thing is that China now is bringing more experts from these countries to China. Several thousand, 150,000 tech experts are intending to visit China. And the key thing about this is that the Chinese have made a very strong statement that they're not going to be a magnet for brain drain, that when technicians and scientists come to China for projects, they are going to make sure these people return back to the countries from which they came to enhance the science and technology potential in this part of the world. Now, it's not all altruism this is being done for, because China intends that these people who have been trained in China become a very good group of people to help with the implementation of projects going forward, because one of the weaknesses in these countries has been the very limited talent pool. So if China can help to advance the talent pool in these countries, it also can ensure greater probability of success in the launching of the projects that it's bringing into these countries. And just to show you that how this thing moves from the central level in Beijing, Tianjin, Shanghai, and Beijing all now have their own version of Belt and Road technology and innovation cooperation. Good example is Tianjin's plan, which is put in place. It has 4 big parts to it. And Tianjin is very active in playing a role, as a training base, as a source of helping to design laboratories and research centers in these Belt and Road countries, helping to promote cooperation in science parks. In other words, this is a very proactive thing. And unless you're really following it, you might not get to see it, because not many people in the West are reading the press and the media in this part of the world. Central Asia, in many cases, was up until recently in the Ukraine, of course, not very much of a lot of attention, but now it's getting a lot of attention. And most set out all these milestones, etc. And these are very ambitious plans. I just will highlight here the cultural exchange that has now taken place between China and Kenya. They've helped Kenya build a joint laboratory on molecular biology dealing with agriculture, so that the crop cultivation can be improved. And then that success in that laboratory can be shared with other African countries to help them improve their agricultural technology. So, when this project began, a number of people had said, China may be able to do things in the lower income or lesser income countries that the West has been unable to do. And what we're seeing right now is that, in fact, that's exactly the case. I think the Chinese are getting much better traction with these kinds of projects than they have been, for example, with some of the larger infrastructure projects. I also want to highlight the role of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, which also has been extremely active. The CAS has opened 9 different training centers across the BRI countries, including a space weather center in Brazil, an innovation cooperation center in Thailand, and a digital Belt and Road platform across many of the BRI countries. There are also now more than 200 college-level international cooperation agreements, more than 1,000 institute-level cooperation agreements. And I'm not going to begin to tell you that each one of these has equal level of activity. Of course, some are more dormant than the others. But the fact is that they're a whole new area that has been opened up. And one of the things that I think is important is this Alliance for International Science Organizations that CAS has been leading the way on. And it founded in 2018. It now has about, at that time, 37 members. And then by 2019, 15 new members joined it, including academies in Athens, Nepal, et cetera, et cetera. So this is not an unimportant piece of this new initiative. And I think that the thing that's interesting, I would say, that despite this emphasis on green and looking at real meaningful collaboration, the nature of technology transfer here is very, very important. And that is that most of the technology transfer is aimed at addressing real development problems in these countries to make the quality of life improved. Much the way that China developed itself in order to eradicate poverty in China, these projects are also aimed at poverty eradication, improving public health, improving the drinking water, et cetera, et cetera. This is all very important stuff. So if we look at this, I referred, there was a very nice little study done in a journal called Sustainability by 3 Chinese scholars who looked at what happened from 2000 and 2018. And they began to see, first of all, the number of countries engaged in S&T cooperation has increased in time, that there's a rise in the number of partners so that there's a cluster effect. In other words, dual participation or multiple participation. And also the center of gravity has shifted from west to east. And China now has surpassed Russia as the preferred partner in a number of these countries. And of course, it's obviously gained ground on the West, which has been dormant or not very much involved. And China also has joined some other countries like India and Turkey as becoming part of the central hubs that are working in this overall effort. So the conclusion that these guys come to is that the overall spatial influence of China is on the rise throughout Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Central Asia. And I think this is an important study for what they discovered. Now, we've all been reading a lot about the digital Belt and Road. I'm not going to go in depth because of the limit on the time, but we have to recognize just how important this is, particularly, the Big Earth data platform that China is building across this area. And we all know that the West has been extremely concerned about security and other related issues that comes from working with Chinese firms like Huawei. But this is going to be a big developmental engine for helping to advance the economies in these countries, and it has great importance. The thing about, I think that's really interesting, is that the digital Belt and Road now is being linked to the UN's 2030 Sustainability Development Goals. And so now that this Big Earth data platform that China is building is designed to address, you can see here from this chart, a whole slew of the SDG priority projects, helping to facilitate the completion of these projects as part of China's overall strategy. So you can see you can earn a lot of goodwill and develop a lot of presence in these countries. I want to talk for a minute about Beidou, because Beidou is, of course, China's answer to the US GPS. One of the most interesting things is that for the first 2.5 years, when I was the EVC at Duke Kunshan, the chancellor was Chancellor Liu Jingnan. Liu Jingnan is often considered to be the father of China's Beidou. And he only spent about 50% of his time at DKU during those years. Because the other part of his time, he was either meeting with Xi Jinping or meeting with officials, on the Beidou project, trying to make sure that it became facilitated and was moving very rapidly. And just like the GPS performs functions in the United States, the countries in the BRI are going to adhere to the Beidou platform. Again, this is something that, whether or not they can walk on 2 legs, these countries, and use the GPS as well as the Beidou, we will see what the political issues are as they begin to do this. And right now, Beidou has made services available to more than 100 different countries around the region. But Again, it's also being used, unfortunately, for some nefarious purposes, like, for example, guidance systems for weapons to Pakistan. So we got to be careful here. There are some issues, and there are some security problems that are on the horizon. And then finally, another part of this is this polar Silk Road that China is also including in it. I think this is really interesting because this is also where science and technology play a critical role. In 2018, China's Institute of Remote Sensing and Digital Earth signed an agreement with Finland to develop an Arctic Space Center to monitor the polar region. And of course, China is looking at this as a polar passage for shipping purposes, and to understand as a result of climate change, et cetera, where the ice might be spreading and could open up a more facilitated route for shipping that doesn't go through the Suez Canal and some of the more traditional routes. It's done a similar thing. I happened to be on a vacation in Iceland and decided to try to find this China-Iceland Arctic Science Observatory, which does exist. It's very real, and it's a very important collaborative project between Iceland and China that has some interesting potential, particularly in terms of assessing environmental impacts. If there were shipping to expand, there might be oil spills, there might be air pollution, and this observatory is going to take a look into those kind of problems. Okay, very quickly, let me talk about education in a few minutes that I have. As I mentioned, talent development and education are also a very important part of this. Very few people realize that, while there are 700,000 plus Chinese students abroad, right before COVID, there were close to 500,000 international students studying in China. And over 300,000 of those students were from BRI countries, accounting for about 65% or 2/3 of the internationalization of Chinese higher education. And this also has included some 47, 48 different agreements in higher education that China has signed. So again, we tend to be sometimes myopic. We look at China from where we sit in the United States or even in Europe. But there really is a need to take a broader perspective here. And I think what China is doing with the BRI countries gives the impetus to us having a much more broader perspective. The 2016, the Ministry of Education issued its own education action plan for the BRI. And during that first initial 3 years, China was going to send students to study in these BRI countries. But also China was going to build these major overseas technology and education bases for long-term sustainable engagement. And I think what I've seen from talking to people is that China understands if it's going to be have a global footprint, it's going to need people who understand how to work and live effectively in these different countries all around the world. And so it's going to need a cadre of people who are professionally competent to be able to deliver, from their projects by working in these BRI countries. And then, as I said before, they need to have people on the ground who can ensure the success of these projects. Not surprisingly, Confucius Institutes have been part of this Chinese education diplomacy. And a study was done by the British Chamber of Commerce that looked at CIs and their role in the BRI, and their bottom line is that the BRI countries, unlike the West, are less suspicious of the Chinese motives than the Western counterparts, and that these countries actually have benefited by getting more young people to study Chinese language or pursue Chinese studies in their schools, and develop even Chinese studies doctoral programs. So I think we're onto something here that we ought to take a closer look at, particularly given the bad press that the CIs have gotten. And this is just an outline of the different initiatives: a university alliance, a Belt and Road Initiative alliance, and a Central Asia alliance, all of which involve key Chinese universities: Renda, Beidou, Beishida, the University of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and Hefei. All of them have BRI college and research institutes now that are in place. Of course, not everything is smooth. They have to deal with language problems. They have to deal with visa issues. They have to deal with some of the sensitive areas for research and also, of course, money. But these things are all very, very, very important. Okay, the last piece in all of this is health diplomacy. And this is something that's has become very important and taken on much greater importance because of COVID. And COVID has changed the game. China saw a very big opportunity as a result of COVID to push itself into the area of health diplomacy, and the so-called Health Silk Road, which had only a marginal role, now is starting to play a much bigger role and have a more defined impact. This comes from a report from the Middle East Institute, which basically, says that China is trying to capitalize on the shortcomings of Western countries' COVID responses for the purpose of cementing its position as a global health leader. And again, this is another step that China is taking. So sometimes we don't give the Chinese enough credit for their sophistication in terms of their foreign affairs conduct. But I think the story I'm telling suggests a much richer picture in terms of understanding all of this. So what's out there? So let me, I have this slide and one more. So clearly, one of the things that I think that we have to understand is that the Belt and Road is not a rigid concept. It's an evolving vision. And it includes something called, the Chinese dream that we know about, but it also includes a regional dream, and maybe it's a global dream. And I think geography doesn't set the limits or define the BRI. The language in all of these plans look at it as a roadmap for how China can integrate itself more deeply into the global economy and not perhaps go through the same route it did. I don't think this is a scheme for global domination by China whatsoever, but it is definitely a pathway for extending Chinese influence and prestige. And the onset of the trade war with the United States has only added greater impetus to the BRI concept and made it of more strategic value to China. And the more decoupling occurs with the US, the stronger I believe that the BRI imperative will become for China. Finally, and I think this is sort of something we need to think about as we enter the Q&A period. There are two things happening for China. One is this expanded level of activity with the BRI countries. But we have to remember the other thing that China wants also is it wants to attain levels of excellence and performance in its R&D system and its universities that are similar to what's going on in the US, Europe, and Japan. So before we become too enamored with all these advances in the BRI, we must remember that increasing success in the first case may not do much to advance China's objectives in the second case. In fact, over-involvement in the BRI part of the world could eventually detract from China's future success in terms of weakening ties, for example, with Western scientists and the Western scientific community. China is going to be faced increasingly with the effort to find a balance between engagement with the BRI countries and engagement with the West. And given where we are in terms of political tensions and the calls for decoupling that have remained in place, it's going to be a very complex process for the Chinese, and they're going to be in a position to have to make some important strategic decisions as they go forward here, particularly if things with the United States and the West remain in a sour state as they currently are at the present time. And with that, I will stop here and say thank you very much.
Thank you, Dennis. That's a fascinating talk. So as you can see, questions have been trickling in. So I think I would start by asking, perhaps rephrasing some of the questions coming from an anonymous attendee, actually. And I think I have similar curiosity as well on this front. Is that, and I'm sure you know that you have been studying Chinese innovation policies for a long time, and long before the BRI initiative. And a lot of the priorities that we see under the BRI are policy priorities that actually have existed prior to this creation umbrella of BRI. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little more about in terms of what are some of the what do you see is the areas of continuity in terms of Chinese innovation policy that are now maybe rebranded and perhaps augmented under the BRI, and what's uniquely new to BRI?
Okay.
And I think this perhaps, is sort of related to a question in our Q&A section as well. And someone in the audience asked whether you could comment on how BRI will help enhance China's S&T and what is in it for China in areas of education and science and technology, and whether you might agree with some of the criticisms that perhaps among the many Chinese that a lot of BRI projects are vanity political projects that don't actually translate into concrete impacts.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's a lot of questions, but okay, let me try. Obviously, there are elements of continuity and there are elements of change, and I think, as I tried to indicate, this 2019 Second Belt and Road Forum, where Xi Jinping was really outspoken, is really the demarcation point. I think whoever raised the question is exactly right. We can see elements of China's involvement beforehand. But the problem is that if you look overall at China's international science and technology relations, it really is in the 13th five-year plan, and the tail end of the 12th and the 13th five-year plan, where China begins to shift its focus. It was a taker before. In other words, it was largely trying to catch up with the West, and its big priority was to make sure it can become further networked with Western industrialized countries and Japan, of course, as well. But I think in the 13th five-year plan and in this whole new BRI stance, we see a change in which China now believes its successes and its achievements in science and technology can become a tool of diplomacy. In other words, a positive tool of diplomacy. These are not just simple, typical technical assistance projects or developmental aid projects. These are now working almost like a full court press across the entire BRI region. And so, I wrote down the word here, momentum and traction. I think there's much more substance to China trying to play a role like the United States might have played a number of years ago when it tried to use, in the 70s and beyond, tried to use our science and technology leadership as a way to strengthen our relationship with other countries. I think China now has something really substantive to contribute. And because it has something substantial to contribute, it no longer is just another developing country. It really is a country that has the wherewithal to make a difference. Now, I talked about the digital Belt and Road Initiative. I think that's one of the most key parts of all of this, because what it's doing, it has now the capability and the capacity to build an infrastructure across this whole area we're calling the BRI initiative. And this stretches far and wide. And if you can imagine that we're going to get, 60, 70, 80 countries adhering to China's standards, participating according to China's rules and protocols, this is really a big game changer, because China didn't have this to offer before, but it has now something really substantial to offer now. And, what strings are attached to it? Again, we know with the infrastructure projects, there were a lot of strings attached to it and a lot of debt that was accumulated by it. And China, was accused of waiting for some of these projects to fail so that it could gain hold of ports and other facilities. This is a very different game. I think what China is looking at right now is that a rising tide benefits all the boats in the water. And I think what China sees is that if it can create markets and help stimulate development, it can create opportunities for Chinese companies and the Chinese economy to cement a long-term position in and among those countries. And this is a place, as we know, for the most part, the West has not been a big player. And even Biden's, statement about wanting to create, an option or an alternative to this, this doesn't, people think it's a lot of fluff, but there's not as much substance of what the Chinese are putting on the ground. Finally, I think that the education part of it is a really key part of it. And as I said, it's a two-way street. China now has world-class universities, and not only Tsinghua and Beidou, or Fudan or Jiaoda, but a lot of others. And it can provide very substantial training for future scientists and engineers, as well as future doctors and healthcare professionals. And that is very important. And it also can provide, as I said, a foundation in terms of talent, so that when these projects come to these countries, the chances of their success are much higher than they would have been without this kind of talent pool present in these countries. So I think the Chinese are seeing it as a win-win. I do not think, to be very honest, there's much altruism in this. There's not a lot of charity, that's going on. This is a very strategic, well thought out, increasingly well thought out. Let me just say it that way. I think if we had to give them, a grade on well thought out, I think before 2019, we might give them a C. But I think as we have gone past 2019, we're going into the B plus, A minus area. They're doing better and better because they've become more sophisticated in how they're going about implementing these projects.
Thank you. That's really informative. And if I may ask a follow-up question on that, and then I think it's really interesting that you point out that the Chinese government and the Chinese companies have been adapting and gaining ever greater sophistication in terms of how they actually implement projects on the ground. And I think in earlier days of BRI, we've all read in the media and read articles about how there has been pushback among a number of host countries on primarily infrastructure projects, in terms of violating environmental and labor standards, in terms of infringing upon sovereignty. Now, and then for the S&T component of BRI, and beyond BRI, in the Western economies, and we have seen pushback against China's 5G, against Chinese companies, technology companies, primarily on the grounds of national security.
Right.
Now, as China pushes S&T and education as a BRI component among the BRI states, do you anticipate we'll see a similar reaction as well? And it seems that we have not seen as much of that so far. And why is that? And do you see that something that will happen in the future? Concerns about national security and pushback.
Right. So, I think this is about the stages of development. It has to do with the fact that a number of these countries are not well off. They're low income, or the best middle income countries. They're looking for some kind of energizer, to help them get their economies off the ground and growing. And the political leaders in these countries are looking to China, or the relationship with China, to help with that. But I anticipate as things start to build and develop, the kinds of questions that will be asked are going to become more sensitive. Chinese intentions and Chinese, their modus operandi, in other words, perhaps are going to be challenged in some cases. You used the term pushback. I think we will see some of that happen. I'll just give you a funny little anecdote. I've been appointed to the Fulbright Specialist Program in the Fulbright program, and there was a project this year, and the project was by Estonia, and the project was they wanted to bring aboard a China scholar from the United States who could help them moderate the impact of China on their economy. That they were feeling that the Chinese presence was creating great pressure, to accept China's terms and conditions, for these different initiatives, whether they were infrastructure or science and technology. And the Foreign Policy Institute in Estonia wanted somebody to help them understand China's modus operandi so they could better manage that relationship and get to more out of it without having to succumb to some of the things that they didn't like. I think the project eventually was canceled. I don't think Fulbright and them came to terms on who would go out there. But I was quite interested in that project because it was very public in terms of what they wanted. I imagine, and I know this to be the case, there are a number of countries who are becoming skittish about some of this. I'm sure the US Embassy in a number of these countries is becoming a purveyor of doubts about, there's no free money from China, there's no free project, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, I have to believe, and this is, I don't think I'm being naive here, I have to believe that this bad PR that had been building up for the first 5-6 years of this initiative since 2013, that for Xi Jinping to take such a public pronounced stand on fixing them does suggest that the Chinese are going to have to be much more careful as they go forward in order to not incur, bad faith, bad will, et cetera, et cetera. So I do see a more sophisticated group of foreign policy people in China dealing with this part of the world. And I think that they recognize, particularly if we're dealing perhaps with a bifurcation of the world economy. And this is something that, would be unfortunate, but we could be dealing with the bifurcation of the world economy in a way in which, the allegiance to China versus allegiance to the West. And China clearly must do everything that it can to sustain the goodwill and good relations that it wants to build with these countries, if that's going to be, in fact, one of the results of the current quasi, decoupling that has started to take place. So I think this is a very seminal thing that's going on, particularly with respect to the setting of technical standards and China's much more activist role in the standards organizations that exist on a regional and international basis.
Thank you. I mean, that's a very thought-provoking answer on, particularly bringing in the aspect of sort of, we now stand in an era where globalization is perhaps in greater question than it's ever been before for a long time. And I know you also recently gave a talk at Stanford about the decoupling between US and China, and then now with what's happening in Ukraine, media are calling this is essentially the start of a new Cold War, and not just a technological Cold War that we've been talking about over the last few years, but the real Cold War, and the prospect of countries having to choose allegiance seem to be more realistic and perhaps scarier than ever. What a scary thought. And what I'm hearing is that you're saying that China has been very proactive. If we are going to divide into technological spheres, China has been much more proactive in promoting standard setting. I mean, but how realistic is this fear that's even possible? That in some time in the near or medium term future, is it actually possible for the world to sort of divide into this technological dichotomy? You're either on Chinese standard or you're on non-Chinese standard.
Well, just think about it. We had Apple and IBM in the United States. We had different standards where Apple computers didn't talk to IBM and IBM didn't talk to Apple. And I'm being trite here a little bit, but my point is that this is not going to be a 0-1, proposition. What it's going to be is going to be a tendency to adhere to one group of standards versus a tendency to adhere to another group of standards. Whether or not this standard is a better standard than the other guys is going to really depend on what else comes with it. And I think that the thing that I find interesting is, and that's why I use the word momentum. Momentum is a really important part of this. The more deeply the Chinese standards and protocols become ensconced in this parts of the world, the more extensive, becomes the diffusion of these standards, the more influence China will command. Once you already have a Huawei, ABC in place, it's easier to get an Huawei XYZ than it is to buy a Cisco or a Qualcomm or whatever the equivalent might be. So I think that this is something that we have to remember, that time is not standing still. And I think there's a certain degree of acceleration that China would like to see happen with this in order to more deepen their ties with these countries. And I think that's also helping to create some degree of caution about maybe China won't be the nice guy, but at least they won't be the bad guy. You know what I mean? And they won't be the one that seems to be taking unfair advantage. I thought the statement about brain drain and brain, a movement back was a very important statement that the Chinese had made, given the fact that during the first, 10, 20 years of the open policy, China lost a lot of people to the West. China has, experienced that problem. And even though there's some reversal of that brain drain and there's a brain gain now, I think China is very being forthright by saying, look, we're not going to allow this to happen, and we're going to send these people back. As I said, it's not just goodwill. It also has a lot to do with the fact that China benefits from having a strong cadre of people in these countries. But I think that there are some problems and some issues that are out there that simply cannot be ignored, and this definitely is one of those. So I think you mentioned the Ukraine, of course. If in fact, if sanctions keep going forward, that's going to put limits on a number of things. Money going to Russia, technology going to Russia, access to equipment, all sorts of things are going to happen. I've been watching, Chinese officials, their statements in the UN and a number of places about what has happened between Russia and the Ukraine. Personally, I would have liked to see stronger Chinese condemnation. But the thing that worries me more is that China has a mixed track record in terms of behaving, watching the sanctions. You remember, of course, the case of Madame Meng and Huawei. The big thing was that, she was dealing with Iran. And, and in violation of all those sanctions. We've heard about China, bringing things to Pakistan, North Korea, and a number of other not so savory, countries. So I mean, the Chinese are going to have to recognize that as a country with global stature, they're going to have to adhere very tightly to some of these sanctions if they're going to be accepted in the family of nations in the way that they want to be respected and recognized, etc. And I think this is an opportunity for them to show their determination to meet that requirement, that standard of conduct that Western countries, I think, are expecting or hoping for from China.
No, we shall wait and see. We only have a couple of minutes left now, and I think that Sherry will be very firm in asking me to stay on time. Unfortunately, there are a number of questions still in Q&A that we won't have time to get to, and I apologize for that. They're excellent questions. But this is being recorded, and this will be made available on our website. So, and I will also like to share with you guys our upcoming events in the next few weeks. So next week we have, well, it's actually not next week, about on March 17th, we have hybrid event on retrofitting Leninism, participation with democracy in modern China by Demeter from Syracuse University. And after that, counterproductive tech war on state business relations matter in China, US by Ling Chen from Johns Hopkins, and Beijing's influence in the US by Asa Stonefish, CEO of Strategy Risks. So thank you again for attending the talk today. And thank you so much, Dennis, for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.